In this video, I'll be covering rewiring of the ignition power source for this relay box used on an aftermarket switch panel installed on this 2001 Ford F250 Superduty with a 7.3 Powerstroke Diesel.
So before we start under the hood, we're going to build the Weatherpack connector and the piece of wire we need here on the bench. So I've already pre-cut a section of wire. Wire's cheap, so I cut it way longer than I need it. And the next step is going to be to assemble the Weatherpack connector. Just the wire stripper. This one's the one I prefer. It's pretty easy and fast and does a great job of stripping wire. Twist the end, and then that fits into our Weatherpack terminal. So because I have a loose end of the wire, I can put the terminal on right now. But if you're doing it otherwise, you have to remember to put the seal on. So it would slide on that way. And this gets crimped in as well. So I can actually do that from the back side by going this way. Since I already stripped the wire, it's a lot easier than trying to go over the stripped wire. So now that I have that in place, I've got my terminal crimper, and I can set it so that it goes and crimps the terminal, or crimps the ears that actually hold the wire in place. That's a nice, good, solid crimp on there. So now I can slide the rubber boot up onto the end of the connector, and then this just gets the seal gets kind of rolled over and crimped in. Gonna not lose it out of the there, and that now the seal is attached to the wire, and then that just simply slides into our Weatherpack connector. Pretty straightforward. You can hear it click in, and then the end of it folds over and locks. So I know Weatherpack's kind of old. It's a little big, but at the same time I had them, so it doesn't cost me anything to use them rather than having them sit in my toolbox. So this will be our assembled wire. I'm going to go ahead and strip a portion of it here at the end so that I can then splice this into the wire that I'm going to have open on the truck side. So I'm actually going to make a splice where this wire will splice into the existing wire, and then I actually have a section of new Ford wire that came pre-terminated just by buying the pigtail. The power for the vacuum pump is down here. It's actually hidden underneath this cable that's running this switch panel. So I've already disconnected my old connector. The old connector I just used just to get it working temporarily was a standard just spade connector, which is pretty terrible. So again, I just wanted to make sure it would work, and I knew that wasn't my long-term solution just because of it coming loose and not being watertight. So what I'm going to do is go underneath here and unplug the factory connector for the vacuum pump. As big as this truck is, and as much stuff as there is, there's not much room underneath the hood. So it actually limits the position where you can mount new accessories and new items. So I can fish the connector up this way from behind my switch box, and there's the connector. So it's got just some random wire loom on it, just some of the old, I guess you could say the old plastic stuff that kind of just falls apart. So I'm going to set that aside for the moment. I'm going to mark the wire based on where I had the connector, and that'll be where I'm going to basically cut the wire and where I'm going to start my splice. That I don't want any of the insulation that's been cut to be exposed, so I need to make sure that when this is done, I cover it with some heat shrink tubing. So I've got just a silver Sharpie that I'm going to use to mark the wire about where I want to cut it and about where I want to strip it from. Turns out I did have to take the switch box out of the way. There was just no way to get to that that splice and T-tap without moving it. So I still have the remnant of the T-tap on the wire. So I'm going to go ahead and use a pair of pliers and just yank that off. Again, I knew it was temporary and I knew it was kind of garbage and probably shouldn't have done it in the first place, but I wanted it to work. So that's what happens sometimes. So I'm going to trim the wire. Again, I'm going to make the start of my cut where, or I made my mark. Now that that's, I guess, free, I'm then going to take my wire stripper, and these are the fancy ones where all you have to do is kind of squeeze it, so it makes life a lot easier. The wire strippers where you have to like turn it and basically get it aligned. There's not enough room in there to operate, but those wire strippers are nice and easy. See how the wire is now like basically stripped, and it's basically where the cut was in the insulation. So when I go to splice the new wire on, all I'll have to do is cover that up with heat shrink. Okay, now that I've got the wire stripped, I'm going to go ahead and slide my heat seal splice on there first before the wire gets too splayed open. Otherwise it's a pain to do this later. So that way you don't forget. I mean, it's kind of one of those things where once you have all the wires kind of spliced in, and then you forget that you're missing the connector, and you got to take it all apart, and it's no fun. Wire that's going to run to the switch panel. So I've got that next, and that's going to I'm going to have that come out the same. And this is exactly what I was talking about, that I stripped this wire too soon, because now I've got to get it through here. And I've got to see if I can get this other one through here. So this is kind of a mess. This is actually what you're supposed to avoid. So but that's where I want it to be. So I'm going to grab this one. Again, I kind of pre-measured it right there for where I'm going to cut it, and then be able to cut that there and not leave this under the hood, so that would be terrible. So again, I've got that cut, and then taking the wire stripper, just being able to strip that jacket off the wire. I can tell already the replacement wire on the pigtail is actually thicker than the wire that's in, it's a heavier gauge than the wire that's in the connector for the vacuum pump. That's because this pigtail is kind of a universal thing, that Ford used this same connector on a whole bunch of stuff. Like there's version of it right there on the AC lines for probably a pressure sensor. There's another one that's over here for another pressure sensor. So, and I think on some of the gas cars, it might have been used for other features as well. So again, this is a heavier gauge wire because they need it to be universal and able to kind of fit on anything. So the next step is to kind of get this in here and start like braiding this all together. Going back, yeah, I should have done this right the first time. That would have been way easier, and it would have been way less effort than what I'm currently doing. And I guess that's just kind of a lesson learned. I mean, I would say one of the true things about electrical wiring is if you don't do it right the first time, going back to do it right the second time is a lot harder. And in most cases, many people just never ever go back. And it's one of those things of, oh, I'll get to it, and then get to it never comes. So that makes it really tough, and then you wind up with like just kind of bad wiring, and you ask yourself, how do you get there? And it's like, well, that's how you got there. So I've got it where it's pretty solid, and now I can line up the connector for putting heat to it. The connector's heat shrink, and it's got a bead of solder in the middle. So you heat it up with a heat gun and the solder melts, and then it heat shrinks the tubing down as well. But I always go back over it with another set of heat shrink. Okay, I've got my heat gun. It's got the shield on it. I'm going to do my best to keep this pointed away from all the stuff that doesn't like to get hot, which is kind of tough under here because there's not a lot of room. I just got to watch everything else to not melt other wires or have anything get weird. So this doesn't actually take that long, but it's just a matter of there. I could see that the solder melted, and yeah, the next step's going to be to put the piece of heat shrink over it. Now I'll grab the heat shrink tubing, then slide this over, going all the way over the connector itself, making sure I'm covered on both sides. Grab the heat gun again and do the heat shrink tubing. Okay, we've got that over the splice. So the next step is to take apart this connector. First step I do is to take the, I guess you could say, the retainer off the back. There's two little tabs, one on each side, so I can do that with just a screwdriver. It'll then be captive on the black wire, so I don't have to worry about it going anywhere. And then that exposes the seal, so I can pry the seal out, and that gives me a view inside. So inside they filled it full of all sorts of stuff. It's probably just dielectric grease and all that. So the way that this comes apart is the red part is actually the retainer. So to get it out, you can push from the back, pry it up and loose. There we go. So that gets the retainer out. Now that the retainer's out, there's little tabs inside of there that you reach in with a screwdriver and lift the tab, and that locking tab is what keeps the terminal in place. So it's kind of a bit of fishing in there because it's hard to see and it's small. So making sure to remove the correct one. There, now that comes out. So that's the old connector and the old wire. And I might just change the entire plastic part of this, just because that way it's a new seal and everything else, and not 21-year-old plastic that might break later. Okay, so now I have the old connector removed after verifying that for sure the new connector does fit in the old position on the old socket on the vacuum pump. So this is the new green gasket that seals it, and then this is the orange, I guess, end plate that we left on the black wire. So on here there's actually only two openings, and the other two are blanked out. That's how the connector seals. It has studs that press into the green gasket. So based on that, I know that the only other hole I go through is the one that's open. I don't have to worry about alignment of the other two. So getting that on there, I can then grab my new connector, and the connector is keyed in such a way that the orange end cap will only go on one way. There's a slot in the top here and a stud or rib on the top there, so that has to go in that way. So I can then push my new connectors into place. I hear them click in. There they go. And I'm going to seat the new green gasket, and then I'm going to slide the orange connector onto the back. So I got the wires installed in the connector. The O-ring and gasket is on this side. I'm going to put the wire retainer in, so the red piece, which just snaps in, and then we're going to go ahead and connect the air pump or the vacuum pump back to where it should be. So there we go. That's pretty simple. So now I've got the wire that's going to connect to my switch box, and I'm probably going to put the switch box back in. Next step is to remove the silly spade connector. I'm just going to trim that off while holding onto it to not lose it into the engine. That little bit of heat shrink tubing, and now I've got the wire. Grab the green seal for my Weatherpack connector and slide that over first before I make the mistake and strip the wire, which should be kind of a mess. So again, using the easy wire stripper, kind of get that off of there, get the terminal kind of put in place. One of the neat things about these like Weatherpack connectors is it actually has a stop that it won't let you slide the wire up too far into there. It actually stops it. So that way if you stop it on the jacket and everything, it'll keep it from just kind of making a mess. So now that I need that, I need my crimpers. Put that on. All right, that's crimped on. Now I've got my green seal all ready to go. So that just goes in there. And then this will kind of lock that in position. Then I grab the male side of the terminal and basically push it in until it locks, and then fold the rear over. So now I have a good connection there, and then it's nice and easy to make my watertight connection. So to finish this up, I'm just going to grab some zip ties and basically probably zip tie this over to the fender so it doesn't bang around. Might try to put it in a spot where I'm not going to drip water directly on the connector. So the hood seam drops into this little gutter, so I might try to stay clear of that a little bit. But that kind of sums up the rewire of the power supply for a switch panel.